All right, and now we have an amateur's guide to microchip decapsulation chemistry with Travis Goodspeed.
Cool. All right, who likes microchips? All right, and if you really love something, you should boil it in acid, right? Okay. This here, let's jump in a little bit closer. This is a complete 32-bit computer, including RAM, ROM. It's connected to some other chips on a board. This is from a PCMCIA card. That stands for People Can't Memorize Corporate Identification Acronyms. For you youngins in the audience, it used to be that you'd buy a laptop and it would weigh more than a brick and it would not have Wi-Fi or Ethernet. And if you wanted to get online, you'd have to install an extra card. This particular chip is from a cryptography card. Back then, they didn't want you to have cryptography in software for fear that it would help the Nazis or something, so they made you buy it as a physical unit. And this was in a Fortezza card, which is the replacement to the Clipper chip, and it had a law enforcement access field in it, so you could have cryptography, but the cops could undo it if they filed the right paperwork. Thankfully, this standard died off in the mid-90s, and we don't use it anymore. So today I'm going to teach you how to take apart a microchip and turn it into bare glass like this, and also how to turn the bare glass into a full photograph of the entire die, and how to do some other cool stuff. Like if you zoom in close enough, does anyone see this like Egyptian tablet-like thingy right here, just to the right of my finger? If you zoom in really close on that tablet and you squint a little, you can actually see the ones and zeros of the boot ROM of this chip. And so when the chip is locked and you're not allowed to read them, you can recover it photographically. And then from the photographs, you can get out like a file that you would load into IDA Pro or Ghidra to reverse engineer. Another thing that's pretty cool to do within the lab, this is one of my GoodFet boards. I designed these as an undergrad as like a bus adapter. But the cool thing about this one is that little circle that's burnt out of the side chip. This chip is an MSP430 F2274. It's a 16-bit microcontroller that contains the firmware to make it this device. And by burning a hole in the outside, I can now shine lights into this chip in order to mess with it as it's running. So despite the hole burned in the packaging of this chip, this board is still fully functional and still does everything it's supposed to. This is another MSP430 chip, which I've live decapped. The hole in this package allows the die to be exposed so that I can shine a camera flash on it. And I'm not doing this to take pictures, although we do have cool pictures of it. I'm shining the camera flash because every transistor on this microchip die is a phototransistor. And if you hit it with light, it starts conducting electricity even though maybe it's not supposed to. And if you hit the entire chip at once with a very bright light, sometimes the readout protection on this chip will fail and you will be allowed to connect a debugger even though the chip is locked and is not supposed to allow its software to be read. And this is how you can get the firmware out of a protected chip. You'll need some equipment to do this. This is my handy dandy hot plate. You'll note that the heat settings are just in numbers from 0 to 10. These very loosely correlate to real temperatures. So you shouldn't trust that it will keep the right temperature at any given time. You need some beakers in order to hold the acids. These are Pyrex glass, And they're great for everything except for the hydrofluoric acid. And the reason for that is that the hydrofluoric acid will eat the glass. And that winds up ruining your glassware and your experiments. You'll need pipettes. So these little doohickeys allow you to pick acid out of one jar and put it into another. The big one on the left is what I use for transferring large amounts in the order of like 5 or 10 milliliters in order to entirely drown a chip and then boil it on the hot plate. The little one I use for stronger acids in order to do the live decapping. And in that style, I need a stronger acid because the weak ones include water, and the water as a catalyst will burn off the bonding wires that connect the chip to the packaging. I've got these little squirt gun bottles with acetone and water and isopropyl alcohol. This is not the type of IPA that you drink. Basically, we're using the acetone to clean gunk off of the chip because it's really good at dissolving stuff. We do this after the acid has broken it apart. The IPA, the isopropyl alcohol, is not as good as acetone at like picking up junk, but it's a lot easier to manufacture IPA cleanly. So if I let acetone dry on the chip, then it will leave a residue behind. But if I use isopropyl alcohol in a second bath for the chip, then I can get that residue off and have clean photographs instead of dirty ones. You'll need a microscope. This is the cheap one that I keep in my lab. I've had this one since grad school. It's, there's a single column that you look down. It's metallurgical, which means that the light comes through the lens to hit the surface, rather than coming up through a glass slide like you might have in high school biology class. And the reason for this is that the silicon dioxide is opaque to light when it becomes thick enough to be a chip. So if you try to shine a light through it, it gets blocked and you see nothing. We also need some chemicals. This is 65% nitric acid. This is the weaker nitric acid that I use. And it's nice for destroying the packaging of the entire chip, because the water inside of it will also take off the bonding wires, and that gets me a very thin piece of glass that I can photograph. I also got the good shit. This is red fuming nitric acid. Instead of being 65% pure, this stuff is 90% pure. It is at least 90% nitric acid, and it is at most 2% water. And that means that it will do very little damage to the bonding wires, and this is how I'm able to remove the packaging from a chip without damaging it. You can use regular nail polish remover as your acetone. Like I said, this stuff is not completely clean. If you let it dry on a surface, you will then see gunk left over. But I don't care because I've got isopropyl alcohol. And for this stage, the 99% reagent grade is a lot better as far as cleaning stuff off and giving you good pictures. Do not use this without a proper fume hood, but you can also use hydrofluoric acid, which is available commercially as rust stain remover, to remove layers of the microchip after you have extracted the glass from the package. This is useful because as we burn lower into the chip, we have fewer things on the surface blocking our view. On a smart card, this is absolutely essential because smart cards will have like a maze of wiring on the surface in order to detect your messing around with them. And you have to remove all of those wires in order to photograph any of the organs of the chip, like where the CPU is or where the RAM is, where the ROM is. And because the hydrofluoric acid dissolves glass, you have to use these like plastic beakers in order to heat it up to knock the chip out. So we're now ready for our first experiment. We are going to use 65% nitric acid, and we are going to dissolve a chip's packaging in it in order to get the bare glass, and then we're going to photograph the glass. So this is the acid that we're using. This is the big 2.5 liter jug. We're not going with the stronger stuff. These are our two chips. This is the CH582M from a company called WCH. They're a Chinese chip manufacturer who has been making lots of different microcontroller class and radio class chips over the past few years. They're doing many which are compatible with Western chips in order to be drop-in replacements. So I bought the entire series, and now I'm photographing all of them in order to see how they relate. You begin with a beaker with the 2 chips in it. Can anyone spot what's dangerous in this photo? Exactly, the fingers and the gloves. So you put the gloves on, you open up the nitric acid. I use this little storage bottle so that I don't have to bring the big jug around, because if I spill something out of that jug, I can like dissolve my oven. After dropping the acid onto the chips, and before any heat is applied, the liquid will turn green, and you'll see this as like, it looks like ink coming off of the bottom of the chip packaging. This is the ground pad and the pins of the chip dissolving within the acid. Green or blue will indicate metals like copper. A proper chemist could tell you more about which means which and why. We then heat the packaging up. We're aiming at about 100 degrees Celsius, which is beneath the boiling point of the acid, but the hotter the acid is, the faster the reaction is. And at room temperature, this acid is not strong enough to dissolve the chip packaging, which is why we have to bump it up a bit. You are aiming for a temperature that is high enough that the package will dissolve, but not so high that the acid will boil off. And all of this is being performed inside of a fume hood with forced air ventilation. So all of the air is being sucked out of the front of the fume hood, where I sit, and then pulled out through the top of the fume hood, and then vented out of a window in order to keep my air clean. After a while, you'll start seeing the package fall apart, and the bare die will be visible, but it will still be covered with a little bit of gunk or residue left over from the chip. Here you can see there's like a chip in the bottom right, and all those little specks, all of that used to be packaging on this chip. Remember, these were 2 packaged chips and some clear liquid when we began. Now the liquid is green and the packaging is crumbling apart like a wet Oreo. Here are the 2 of them, this little square here and that one up there. Because they're still covered in gunk, we can't photograph them yet. So to fix that, we spray acetone over them in order to knock off a bit of the surface gunk. And this leaves us with the 2 bare dice at the bottom of a beaker of acetone, which we put into an ultrasonic bath. This is a commercial jewelry cleaner. Some other people who do this sort of work, they don't like to use the ultrasonic bath because the sharp edges of the chips hitting against the side of the beaker will sometimes chip or damage them. And you can see this damage in my dye photographs. Here's a close-up. You can see the 2 dice here. The gray one on the left is upside down. You will see a flat gray for the bottom side of almost every chip. The front side is what has all of the pretty colors and the fancy wiring in it. And that's usually covered in more gunk than the back side is. As soon as you hit the button on your ultrasonic cleaner, all of this black gunk will start shaking around and very quickly falling off of the chip and dissolving within the acetone. So very quickly we have 2 clean dice. We then take these to the cheap microscope. This is the one in the lab. And we put it under the light and we look at it. And all we're looking to see at this point is like how much gunk is left on the dye. If I see a lot of it, I'll dump it into another acid bath. I might use a different acid, such as sulfuric acid, depending upon the epoxy chemistry of that individual package. And then the end result is this clean dye floating in This is floating in isopropyl alcohol. And remember, isopropyl alcohol is good because it is clean. I take it down to my photography table this way, still in the beaker. And then as I remove it, I have one remaining problem, which is that even though the isopropyl alcohol is a lot cleaner than the acetone, it's still not perfectly clean. There is some microscopic stuff dissolved in it. And if I allow it to dry on the surface of my chip, then it's going to leave behind a little residue that will show up in my photographs. To fix that, I use computer air duster. And with my tweezers, I hold the dye in place as I do a burst of air from the side. This causes all of the isopropyl alcohol to fly off the side, taking its dissolved stuff with it. And that gives me a clean dye that I can photograph. If this step messes up, or if I don't use clean tweezers, or if like dirt from the surrounding area, or maybe a moth comes in and flies onto it, I've not ruined everything, I just have less clear photographs. So many of these stages can be skipped if you just need to quickly answer some small question, like does the chip have mask ROM visible from the surface? At this point, I use a better microscope. This microscope is still a cheaper model. It's an M scope. It's about yay tall. It has 2 binoculars for my eyes, and then it has a 3rd trinocular adapter for a camera. This is a USB-C camera that runs straight to my desktop, and I have a hotkey. Whenever I hit the power button on my Sun Type 6 keyboard, it snaps a photograph and stores that as part of the set. At low magnification, sometimes you can fit the entire chip within view, but we want like crazy details. We would rather have an image of a size that we could blow up to fill an entire wall, rather than of a size that is napkin or book sized. So the way to do that is just to switch to the higher magnification lens within the microscope. And as we do that, we have the problem that we only get to see one corner of the chip, and not everything is in focus. Over here on the far right side, the focus is off. So what we can do is we can move around, right? If I move the microscope a little bit to the right, I get another view. And if I move it a bit further, I get a 3rd view. Jumping back to the far left here, we can start stacking these images together, right? Because these 3 are the same chip, just shown in different positions. So if we photograph the entire chip that way, we can overlap them in order to create a single panorama with the entire chip in view. Doing this manually works fine for a chip like this, where I can fit the entire width in only 3 photographs. But it is excruciating for larger chips that require many different steps. So there's this computer program called Huggin. Huggin is a graphical user interface for another package called PanoTools. And Huggin has looked at all of the images in my collection, and all of these little points that you see highlighted are the same point between the left image and the right image, even though the left image and the right image are at different locations. And so Huggin is able to identify all of these overlapping points and crunch the numbers together and then throw out the ones that are false positives or poor matches. And if it works out right, it can then take all of the different photos that I've taken, maybe 100 of them, maybe 500, and it can stitch them into a single composite image of very high resolution, where I can zoom in on any details that I need, or see any piece of the chip conveniently. And you can recognize a few details of this from the surface. Like on the bottom, you see that some of those little squares have a circle in them and some of them don't. Those are bonding pads. And anything with a circle on it has had a bonding wire ripped off. Anything without a circle never had a connection. So maybe if we touch a needle to one of those, we can access a special test mode of the chip that was used during manufacturing but never packaged. On this particular chip, there was a second die that would sit in the middle, and this upper row on the bottom would connect to that second die, while the bottom row would connect to the outside of the physical packaging. So we might be able to tap the communication between the two dice within this package by touching needles to one and not to the other. We also see those like octagons in the top right. Those are inductors. That tells us that this is a radio chip and not a simple microcontroller. But sometimes we need to see beneath the surface. So the next experiment we're going to do is using rust stain remover. This is like 3% hydrofluoric acid. Do any of you watch Breaking Bad? Do you remember in the first season when he kills the bad guy in his basement and they have to get rid of the body? So he brings some chemical jugs home from the high school that he works at and dissolves the bodies in them. That's hydrofluoric acid. It is not true that it would dissolve the whole body, but it would dissolve the bathtub. So they got the math half right. Because it dissolves glass, you need to use a plastic beaker for this, of a particular sort that can handle the temperatures. And the reason why we do this, this is a surface photograph of a chip from a blood glucose sensor. If you're diabetic and you want to check your insulin without having to stab your finger, you can put one of these things on your shoulder and then you can tap it with your phone, and your phone will ask this chip what your blood glucose is. It's a medical godsend, especially for stubborn patients who don't want to deal with finger pricking. But if you look at the surface of it, you see that it's like kind of faint and blurry. And if you zoom all the way in, you can see that there's this pattern of like little metal dots. And this pattern is a fill layer in order to have fewer gaps on the surface. Smart cards will go a step further, and all of this metal will be connected into a crazy maze so that the maze can't be broken while keeping the chip functional. For photography, we've already broken the chip. We've already removed all of the bonding wires, but we want to know what's beneath the surface. So this is the chip at the top, and if we boil it in hydrofluoric acid for like 5 minutes, we can remove that top layer and begin to see more organs of the chip. We can now see where the ROM is. We can see where the SRAM is. This chip has a crazy non-volatile memory called FRAM, and we can also identify that visually. And you can see pieces of it. Like if I flip between them, some of these large areas are completely invisible from the surface, some of these big rectangles. And then as I jump down, they become visible, and if I go just a bit further, they become really well separated. And I can now see that like the CPU is probably that T on the right, and that the memories are in different locations. And this lets me understand more about the chip that I'm working with. The extreme end of this is reverse engineering the gate structure of the chip, which I've not done firsthand, but which you can find in literature for like the MyFair Classic had its cryptography reverse engineered. This is an NXP RFID tag used for building access. Karsten Knoll and Starbug and Henrik Platz and a few other fine people, they took these delayered photographs of that RFID tag, and they were able to reverse engineer the proprietary cryptographic algorithm used by the tag in order to recover the keys of all of the tags and break that system. So this is great if you're trying to photograph a dead thing, if you're trying to see what used to be there and then get rid of it. Our final experiment for today is going to involve the stronger acid. This is red fuming nitric acid. This is at least 90% nitric acid. This is at most 2% water. When you open this bottle, there is like a mist of acid fumes that come out of it. This is the one that you really want the gloves on for. And use latex gloves. Do not use nitrile gloves, not the blue ones. The blue ones will catch on fire if you put 3 drops of this stuff on them. This is our friendly neighborhood Fortezza card, trademarked by the NSA, I think. In the mid-90s, you would use this for secure telephones. You would have a PCMCIA slot on the side of the phone, you would insert your card, you would know your PIN number, and this would allow you to make secret phone calls. You could also plug it into your laptop, and your laptop could use it to send secret emails. All of these cards have long died. They depended upon a battery that would back up RAM in order to hold the keys. So as the batteries died, all of the keys died with them. A fellow who also does chip photography by the name of John McMaster just sent me a giant box of them, and I'm going to see if I can get the code out or something fun with them. But for today, we're going to use this as our target example. So this is the PCMCIA card with the metal packaging removed. You can see the card slot on the right, which is what we connect to the laptop motherboard. And this big Microtronics chip, the MYK82 by VLSI Semiconductor, this is the secret sauce chip. And you can see there's an ARM logo in the corner of the chip. That's how we know that this contains a CPU. In order to live decap this, we first heat it up on the hot plate, and then we take some of the red fuming nitric acid and we move it to a beaker using the large pipette. This is the last time that I will use the large pipette because the small pipette with a very teeny tip allows me to put very little acid onto my target. When I first started doing this, I would use a metal mask using like metal duct tape. I stopped doing that because I found that it was easier to just put a very little amount of acid in the center of the chip, patiently wait for it to drill down, and then wash it off with acetone. So we take just the tiniest bit out. You can see the yellow in the pipette is very, very little. And then I put just a single smallest possible drop, and this drop has to come directly from the tip like you would use in a fountain pen. This can't be a drop that builds up and then falls off of the tip because that will be too much acid. I let it sit there and sort of bubble away for just a second, and then I move the board over to a large beaker and I squirt acetone out of my squirt gun bottle at it. And you can see the acetone sort of running down the side of it. The boiling point of acetone is very low. So as I squirt the stuff out, the board still dries off very quickly and I'm not leaving behind any residue. You can see that there's this little circle in the center and that the VLSI logo is damaged. This acid has torn away that small bit of the packaging of the chip while leaving everything else intact. All of the other pins are intact, there is no rust elsewhere on the board, there is no damage. I keep repeating this. I keep putting just the tiniest bit in to fill that cavity that I'm drilling down. Under heat, I wait for that cavity to expand, and then I put more onto it. And with each step, the circle grows a little bit wider and a little bit deeper. And eventually, we start seeing stuff inside. This piece here is actually a copper ground plane. I don't know whether it's a security feature or whether it's a coincidence, but the die in this chip is actually stored upside down. This does become a good demonstration, though, for why the copper metal on the top of the chip is not damaged by the red fuming nitric acid. In this photo, I've only used red fuming nitric. If I then put a little drop of the 65% nitric, it starts changing color, becoming less shiny. And if I leave that drop there, it boils in this green color, which, as I told you before, indicates that metal is breaking apart and then forming compounds with the acid. And if I go far enough through this, using red nitric again, this little glass here is the backside of the microchip, which has none of the interesting details, but will do things like allow infrared light to leak out. So you can run the chip in a dark room under a microscope and then record the session in infrared light in order to see which pieces are lighting up. A fellow by the name of Dmitry Nedospasov does some experiments with that. I can then repeat this on the SRAM chip U4 down in this corner in order to expose it. But what I really want is the top of the VLSI chip to see that same picture in the glass. So I turn it upside down. You can see here that the secret government chip was made in Taiwan. And then I repeat the same experiment. I put a tiny amount of acid in the middle of it. I allow that to boil up. I wash it off with acetone. This forms like a little cavity, and then as I repeat this, eventually the dye is exposed. And now I've got the functioning microchip visible from the surface without damaging any of the bonding wires or breaking the chip or its functionality. These experiments are not so useful on their own or without combining it with something else. So you might want photographs of a chip in order to know what model number it is. Many times when you're taking something apart, you'll find a black epoxy blob on the board with no package that has a part number, but you still need to know what's inside. And this sort of chemistry can answer that question for you. You also sometimes find a chip that is locked, and you're not allowed to read the firmware out of it. By removing the lid of the package and shining a light in, either a laser at some particular area or by hitting a camera flash to the entire thing, you can confuse the flip-flops that record the state of whether or not you're allowed to read the memory out of the chip. And by knocking them loose, you can then freely read the firmware out and get a copy of like the firmware to protected medical equipment. You can stick needles into the chip. They make these micro-positioner probes that have like an etched tungsten needle coming off the edge of them, and they have little knobs that you turn in order to move that needle around the chip and touch a particular area. And then they have an amplifier so that you can see that signal on your oscilloscope even though that signal never was supposed to have been brought out of the chip. If you can touch an address or a data line this way, you can then leak memory out of the chip or sort of watch as it's doing its thinking. It's a hell of a lot of fun to be able to do this. I got out of this hobby for 10 years, and I recently got back into it. I converted my upstairs kitchen. All of the photos that you've seen today and all of the techniques are from my home lab. So, and this is Nacho. He is Nacho Cat. Thank you for your time and attention. And if you have any questions, I'd like to hear them. And I've also got a couple of books to give away of Pocket GTFO from No Starch Press. Yes?
How did you discover all of this?
So the question was, how did I discover all of this? Very little of this is entirely new work. Most of this I've learned from books or from discussions with other people. Chris Tarnowski and Brooke Hill helped me out when I was getting started, and John McMaster helped me get back into this hobby after I left it and all of my tools in storage. The proper technical name for this in forward engineering, as opposed to reverse engineering, it's called failure analysis. And you can find books on failure analysis chemistry that walk you through all of these procedures, but they sort of assume that you're going to have a very well-funded lab to do it in. And so they don't answer such questions as like, what's the best equipment to purchase by eBay, or which chemicals can I get at the Home Depot? Questions which are important if you're trying to do this at home. So, yes?
Why can't you use a a metal applique instead of the plastic pipette to gently apply the higher strength acid to decap?
So it's not that the acid has no reaction against the metal. it's the reaction becomes buffered by the initial reaction. Sort of like stainless steel in atmosphere. The surface of stainless steel is a very fine layer of rust. Which is why, like, and same for aluminum. So if you put gallium or mercury on top of aluminum, you can rust it all to hell. Similarly, the pipette, the plastic one has no reaction against the acid. I can leave a pipette sitting in the acid for a week, come back and none of it has been damaged. For metal, it buffers enough that I'm not going to damage the wires during any individual reaction. But if I were to like forget that I had the acid there and I would leave it, then eventually the water from the atmosphere would be enough of a catalyst to melt a metal pipette. Yes?
So for light, camera flash, everything just booms. But with a laser, how accurate can you get? As in, can you touch a single transistor, or is it?
Right, so and again, the single transistor thing is something that I've read about but not done firsthand. In CMOS, you basically have one transistor that is pulling the voltage high and another that pulls it low, and you balance all of these so that they don't conflict with each other. The easiest thing that you can do with laser focused through a microscope is you can hit the transistor that is supposed to not be conducting, and then it will conduct a little bit, and you will be wasting electricity between high and low voltage. There's a fellow by the name of Sergei Skorobogatov. I hope that I'm pronouncing that right. He did a dissertation on these sort of like semi-invasive photovoltaic attacks where you have opened up the packaging invasively, but you're not sticking any needles in, you're only shining light in. As for light against the whole package, you are damaging the state of like half the flip-flops. SRAM will sometimes go wonky. You have to arrange it so that when everything gets scrambled, the piece that you wanted to hit also flips over, and then you can correct everything else. So in my case, for using that technique against an MSP430, that allowed me to connect a debugger, and then through the debugger I was able to like reset all of the values that I needed for the flash memory to work, and all of the other configurations in I/O. Cool. Yes, any other questions?
Yes.
Yes.
So is there any chip that this won't work on, or will it work on most of them?
So the question was, is there any chip that this won't work on? There are chips that I've read about which will include like a MEMS function, like an accelerometer. And then if the MEMS, microelectrical mechanical systems, they're really tiny and fragile. And the acids that I'm using might damage that as I'm taking the chip apart. So you can use that as a sort of sensor. You can also include like a phototransistor in order to intentionally recognize the background light. I've read about these being in smart cards, but most of my practical experience has been with consumer microcontrollers, which do not include these features because they would decrease the reliability and increase the cost of the chip without providing any advantage to the manufacturer. So defenses against this are possible, but they're rare. Even the Microtronics chip that I showed, it has the die upside down, but it has nothing else that I've found that tries to make it hard to take apart. So, yes?
Do you keep on using bases to neutralize any acids?
Excellent question. No, I'm a bit lazy about that. I boil it off, or I use baking soda.
What was the question?
Oh, the question was, do I use any bases to react against the acid in order to make it neutral before disposing of it?
Or for safety?
For a spill, I drown the finger in soap and I cuss like a sailor. It is important to know the difference. The 65% nitric, it's like it numbs your nerves before it starts melting your flesh. So if you spill some of it, it's like a little tingly feeling, but it doesn't actually hurt until the next day when a big chunk of your finger is gone. And when you start using latex gloves with it, you'll notice that they turn yellow. which is all of the acid that you would have gotten on your fingers if you hadn't used the gloves. And that's why it's important to use these safety things ritualistically rather than only when you expect that you're doing something dumb as shit. It's the hold my beer principle of safety.
So how do you want to give away these books? Do you
All
want
right.
to ask some questions? Do you want to do some challenges? Or so those are for a different thing.
Oh, these are for different
Those
things.
are for the lock picking challenge.
Okay. The kid in the black Hills shirt, if you could pass this back to him. And I've got volumes 2 and 3. Who would like each? Yes. And one more? All right. If you could pass that to him so that I don't...
Gentleman in the B-sides, maroon B-sides t-shirt. Which B-sides is that? Tampa. I like it. I like the pirate theme.
Cool. And that's the end of my show. Thank you for your time and attention.